Hey, lockdown is over, at least for some of us. So now we can hit the big outdoors, legally. Hi, I'm Boriana. Welcome to Art Unplugged. In this video, I would like to talk to you about the fine art of landscape painting. Landscapes are rarely controversial and generally pleasing to the eye, so no wonder they remain the preferred choice when it comes to interior decoration. But is that all? Or is there something more to a landscape than meets the eye? Let's see. In China, landscape has been for centuries the most prominent form of art. However, in Europe, its history has been more uneven. Landscapes were used for decoration in Roman buildings. However, during the Middle Ages, they disappeared completely. They reappeared again in the Renaissance as backdrops to portraits, religious paintings, and mythological scenes. It wasn't until the 1600s in Holland that landscape gained the right to exist as an independent genre. Why would that be? Isn't it natural to turn to nature when we look for harmony, peace, inspiration? Turns out that in Christian Europe, people turned to God when they needed such things. And the Christian God preferred to have all the attention on himself and his message rather than the creation. Meanwhile, Asians found the divine in the harmony of nature. The result? European art ended up dominated by biblical paintings, Asian by landscape. Now, in this video, I'm focusing on the Western tradition of landscape painting, because Asian art deserves a video of its own. The subject is huge and very, very interesting. So let's return now to Europe and see what happened in the 17th century Holland that gave rise to the landscape as a separate genre. Well, Calvinism. Calvinism is a form of Protestantism which prohibits religious paintings in churches. So while in Catholic Europe churches looked like this, in Calvinist Holland they suddenly turned into this. Obviously, artists had to look for alternative subject matter, so they turned to scenes of everyday life and landscape. Joachim Patinier developed the so-called world landscape, a style of panoramic landscape with small figures and using a high aerial viewpoint that remained influential for a century. Some of the landscapes of the time depicted the typical Dutch nature of flatlands and windmills. Others were imaginary Italian landscapes with mountains, Mediterranean golden light and ruins. That was the fashion, and many artists could produce such landscapes without ever visiting Italy. For the next couple of centuries, landscapes will be idealized, mostly reflecting Arcadia, a utopian ideal drawn from classical poetry. Indeed, certain styles became so popular that they turned into formulas and were copied again and again. So if you have walked past endless landscapes in museums, feeling bored and hoping for a shortcut to the cafeteria, you are not alone. There was also the so-called hierarchy of artistic genres, which put on top historical painting and landscape pretty low in the pecking order. So in order to raise the profile and of course the price of their landscapes, some artists resorted to including small mythological or historical figures in their landscapes. Others, like the Italian Salvatore Rosa, in order to spice up his landscapes, started including some banditti. Here comes a true visionary, right? The 18th century brought the frivolous, decorative and shallow style of the Rococo, with its proliferation of imaginary idyllic landscapes brimming with cherubs, nymphs and damsels on swings. You can tell that things were going in the wrong direction, and the whole thing didn't really end up well. So, as you can imagine, all the upheaval of the French Revolution and its fallout around Europe inevitably brought drama into art. The period known as Romanticism emphasized on the power of the imagination, of the individual and his emotion, and the sublime embodied by the grandeur of nature. Landscape, though not center stage yet, got a new lease of life, and some of the finest examples of the genre were created then. Romantic landscapes were also deeply symbolic. The wild, untamed wilderness with its dark forests, soaring peaks and rushing water was opposed to the fragility of human life. Caspar David Friedrich's painting, Wanderer Above a Sea of Cloud, is emblematic for this period. By placing the lonely wanderer with his back to us, the artist makes us look at the tumultuous landscape through his eyes and possibly share his thoughts. One of the giants of romantic landscape, William Turner, was a visionary who did not hesitate to break the rules to the extent that some of his works border on the abstract. Look at the drama which unfolds here. The fragility of human life is represented by the small boat with its flickering lamp against the power of nature, represented by the dark clouded sky, the wide sea and the threatening rocks on the background. The cold light of the moon at night contrasts with the warmer glow of the lamp, one of many oppositions which build the drama in this painting. We see another dramatic marine scene in this painting by the Russian Romanticist painter Aivazovsky. A group of people are clinging to the mast of a wrecked ship in anticipation of the ninth wave, which according to a traditional belief is the strongest and deadliest in a cycle. Note how Aivazovsky weaves in a Christian message of hope here, expressed in the rising sun and the warm light which permeates the scene, and the fallen mast in the shape of a cross. In America, the romantic landscape was reflected in the work of the artists of the Hudson River School. Now, all the landscapes that you saw up to here have been painted indoors. It was impossible to take all the gear necessary for oil painting out of the studio, so all artists could do was take sketches, make some notes, then return to the studio and paint there. However, in the 19th century, oil paints became available in tubes, so artists immediately took advantage of that and went out painting au plein air, or in the open air. The first ones to do that were the artists from the Barbizon school in France. However, the real turning point for landscape happened a little bit later in 1860 with the Impressionist revolution. Art turned from this into that. The Impressionists were interested first and foremost in the effects of light. And what better field of exploring light than, well, a field? In order to capture the effect of the changing light, Monet, the quintessential Impressionist painter, used to work on several versions of the Rouen Cathedral at different times of the day. Landscape, which had been considered a lowly genre until now, was suddenly a prime-time material and a field of experimentation. By the end of the 19th century, landscape was the arena where art history was played out. In the 20th century, landscape adapted really well to abstraction, and you might be interested to know that nowadays the best-selling genre in the affordable art segment is the abstract landscape. Landscape photography also established itself as an art form in the 20th century. In contemporary art, landscape has evolved from depicting nature to working within nature. We know the interventions of Christo and Jean-Claude, for example, and the phenomenon of land art, where artists intervene in the landscape itself. So, how does a landscape artist decide on what to paint? Choose a beautiful site, plant the easel, and bang, start to paint. Well, not quite. As it is impossible to depict nature in its totality, painting even the most realistic landscape is an exercise of prioritizing and eliminating. The view in front of us is nothing but a starting point and a framework. Typically, an artist would think, Is there anything here that I can build a visual intrigue around? Something that I can accentuate, move, remove, or add in order to have a convincing composition? And there are several key elements to play with. One of them is the horizon line, which in a painting equates the artist's and the viewer's eye level. The horizon line defines to a large extent the mood of a painting. A high horizon line allows us to see huge expanse of land. A low horizon line gives us huge skies. Some artists turn their eyes down and show us a reflected world. And did you know that traditional Chinese landscapes contain many viewpoints? This is because, unlike Western art, which gives an image to be admired in its entirety, the intention of a Chinese landscape is to take the viewer on a spiritual journey and is to be admired by following the path, sometimes climbing hills, descending valleys, crossing bridges, and so on. The post-impressionist painter Cézanne, who was familiar with this, incorporated two viewpoints in his landscapes, mimicking the way we see things as we move our eyesight and our bodies in space. Look at this painting, which has been painted from a fairly high viewing point. The horizon line coincides with the upper third of the canvas. However, we seem to look at the building on the left-hand side from below, from much lower point of view. If we were looking at it from the same point of view as the rest of the landscape, it should look more or less like the buildings on this painting, where we can see the roofs. Perspective is another element of landscape which is particularly important for creating a sense of space. Perspective is a way of recreating the three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface. There are two types of perspective. Linear perspective means that parallel lines converge in one point on the horizon. Aerial perspective takes into account the effects of atmosphere on the way we see. Objects further away from the viewer appear paler, bluish, and somewhat blurry. Look how masterfully the artist here has used both linear and aerial perspective. Linear in the shadows of the trees, and aerial in the contrast between the golden yellow sunny spot and the blurred bluish pale background. In fact, perspective here is the visual story of the painting. But above all, the most important element in a painting is its composition, the organization of the visual elements on the canvas, and that includes lines, shapes, color, light and dark. The role of composition is to lead the eye of the viewer towards one center of interest, take it around, and then return it to it again. Look at this small landscape where the main visual story is about the interplay between the two complementary colors, yellows and violets. The eye is immediately attracted by the setting sun and the little dots that lead to it. Then it is attracted to the yellow of the cloud above. Then it returns gently by the stepping stones of the rocks on the right side of the painting and ends up returning again to the center of interest. We see a more complex composition in this painting by Constable, another great romantic artist. First, the river leads us to the center of interest, which is the cathedral, and then the rainbow encloses it in a circle. Another method for achieving depth is the alternating of light and dark areas, like we see in this painting by Corot. And here is a painting by Turner. I bet you that the tree that he made a center of his composition did not exist there. He just added it as a recognizable element of the Roman landscape. And now that you're familiar with some of the tricks of the trade, next time you look at a landscape, try to think what was the artist thinking behind it. What tricks did she use in order to draw your attention and keep it there? I promise you, your experience of landscape art will never be the same. The subject of landscape art is huge and very interesting, and in future videos I'm going to zoom in artists and movements, so stay tuned. I hope you found this video interesting and you learned something perhaps. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done that already. Thanks for watching and hope to see you very soon. Bye.